In the winter of 1428, the fate of France narrowed to a single bend of the Loire River. There stood Orléans, the last major stronghold guarding the road south. If it fell, English armies, already deep into northern France, would split the kingdom in two, choke off the heartlands, and end the long, exhausted Valois cause. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for generations. Morale was threadbare, treasuries hollow, and loyalty uncertain. Orléans was not just a city, it was a hinge of history. The English understood this with brutal clarity. In October 1428, an expedition under the seasoned Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, arrived before the walls. Their strategy was not a single storming assault, but a tightening ring. They erected a necklace of fortified positions, bastilles, around the city, each designed to cut supply lines and batter morale. The strongest of these, Les Tourelles, dominated the southern bridgehead. From there, English guns could rake the approaches and deny relief from the south. Artillery mattered now as never before. As never, cannons, still temperamental, still inaccurate, had matured enough to terrify defenders and crumble masonry. Salisbury himself was struck by a fragment while surveying the walls and soon died, a reminder that this new age of war spared no rank. Yet the English pressure did not ease. The city endured bombardment, hunger, and the steady knowledge that no rescue seemed possible. Inside Orléans, conditions worsened. Food prices soared. Disease stalked cramped quarters. The garrison, an uneasy mix of professionals and militia, watched the ring close. The French crown, embodied in the uncertain figure of Charles VII, seemed far away and powerless. His legitimacy was contested, his resources thin. Many believed Orléans would inevitably fall, and with it the last hope of a French revival. Then came the interruption no strategist had planned for. In early 1429, a teenage peasant girl appeared at court claiming divine guidance. She said saints had charged her to lift the siege and crown the rightful king. Her name was Joan of Arc. To modern ears, the claim sounds implausible. To contemporaries, it was unsettling, provocative, and strangely compelling. Desperation lowers the threshold of belief. After examination by theologians and much hesitation, Charles allowed her to accompany a relief force to Orléans. Joan did not command in the technical sense. She carried no rank, issued no formal orders. What she brought was conviction and a clarity that cut through paralysis. Clad in armour, bearing a white banner rather than a sword, she entered Orléans on 29th April 1429. The effect was electric. Chroniclers speak of spirits lifting, of men standing straighter, of a city that had learned to breathe again. What followed was not a single miraculous charge, but a series of hard, coordinated actions. Joan pressed the commanders to abandon caution and strike the English bastilles one by one. On the 4th of May, the French attacked Saint-Lô to the east. The fight was savage and close. When the Bastille fell, it proved the English could be beaten. 2 days later came Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, then the Augustins on the south bank. Each success tightened French confidence and loosened the English grip. The climax came on the 7th of May at Les Tourelles. It was the keystone of the siege, a fortified complex guarding the bridge. The assault began at dawn and dragged through the day. English longbowmen inflicted heavy losses. Cannon roared, ladders splintered. Joan was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder and briefly carried from the field. The attack faltered. Many expected retreat. Instead, she returned. Bandaged, exhausted, she rallied the troops for a final push. As evening fell, the French surged forward. A fire broke out within the English works. A drawbridge collapsed. By nightfall, Les Tourelles was in French hands. The ring was broken. The next morning, the 8th of May, 1429, the English abandoned the siege. and withdrew. Orléans was saved. The consequences rippled outward with astonishing speed. Militarily, the victory reopened the Loire corridor and restored French initiative. Psychologically, it shattered the aura of English inevitability. Politically, it transformed Joan from curiosity to catalyst. Within weeks, French forces swept through the Loire Valley. Within months, Charles VII was crowned at Reims, a ceremony that reinforced his legitimacy and reframed the war. Yet the siege's meaning runs deeper than banners and walls. Orléans marked a turning point in how wars were won. Artillery, morale, and leadership now intertwined. The English had the guns and the positions. The French rediscovered belief and coordination. Joan's role, part inspiration, part relentless advocate for action, showed that resolve could unlock dormant strength. She did not replace generals, she compelled them to act. For France, Orléans became a symbol of survival. The kingdom did not immediately triumph. Years of fighting remained, but it no longer expected to lose. The war's long arc bent away from extinction. For Europe, the siege foreshadowed a new era, where cities, cannon, and national identity would shape conflict as much as knights and crowns. In the end, Orléans stands as a reminder that history often turns at its weakest moments. A starving city, a doubtful king, a teenage girl with a banner. From that unlikely convergence came the battle that saved France and changed the course of a century-long war. Now, let the centuries dissolve into the grey mist of the past, and let us stand together on the banks of that great river before the cannons roared. Before the girl arrived, in the quiet, trembling moment before the storm. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and smell the scent of wet stone, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of impending snow. Feel the damp chill of late autumns seeping through your clothes. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves in a land that feels less like a kingdom and more like a broken mosaic. It is 1428, and France is a concept more than a reality, a ghost haunting its own borders. To understand why a single city mattered so much, we must look at the map through the eyes of a weary traveller. Imagine France not as a hexagon, but as a torn tapestry. The north, including the glittering jewel of Paris, is held firmly by the English and their powerful allies, the Burgundians. They are administrative, efficient, and relentlessly expanding. In the south, holding court in the city of Bourges, is the Dauphin, Charles VII, a man whom his enemies call the King of Bourges, with a sneer that probably hurt more than he admitted. He is uncrowned, underfunded, and seemingly paralyzed by melancholy. Between these two realities flows the Loire River. It is a wide, muscular ribbon of water that acts as a natural moat, a barrier of liquid iron that separates the English conquest from the desperate French remnants, and on the northernmost bend of this river sits Orléans. We are floating above it now. It is a prosperous city, proud and ancient, shaped like a kidney bean pressed against the north bank of the river. It is not a grim outpost, but a centre of trade, wine, and university learning, now forced to wear the heavy armour of war. The walls are high and thick, punctuated by towers that look out over the flat plains of the Beauce to the north, a landscape so flat that locals joke you can see a visitor leaving 3 days before they are gone. But the true marvel and the true vulnerability is the bridge. It is a magnificent stone spine stretching over 400 yards across the river, 19 arches of masonry connecting the north bank to the south. It is the only crossing point for miles. Whoever holds this bridge holds the keys to the south of France. If the English take it, they can pour their armies across the river into the Dauphin's territory, shattering the last resistance like a hammer hitting glass. The air in the city is thick with rumours. Everyone knows the English are coming. They've been devouring towns along the Loire all summer, Meung, Beaugency, Jargeau, creeping closer like a slow-rising tide. Historians still argue whether the English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, was actually ordered to take Orléans, or if he went rogue, seduced by the glory of capturing such a prize. London had technically warned him against it, preferring a more cautious campaign, but Salisbury was a man of the old school, believing that war was won by seizing the biggest piece on the board, and so the people of Orléans prepare. They are destroying their own suburbs, the beautiful houses, the churches, the monasteries outside the walls, levelling them to the ground so the English will have no shelter. It is a painful, necessary self-mutilation. Imagine the sound of families tearing down the roofs they grew up under, the dust of centuries rising into the pale winter sky. It is a time of waiting. The silence before the siege is heavier than the battle itself. The river flows on, indifferent to the panic of men, its waters grey and swollen with autumn rain. We are waiting for the first glint of English armour on the horizon, the first rumble of the heavy wooden wheels carrying the bombards that will try to turn this city into dust. The winter is coming, and it promises to be the coldest the world has ever known. Let us drift closer now, hovering just above the slate-grey waters of the Loire, where the current curls and snaps against the stone piers of the bridge. To understand the siege, you must understand this bridge. It was not merely a way to cross the water, but a small city unto itself, a living artery of stone stretching nearly 400 yards from the north bank to the south. In the medieval mind, a bridge was a holy thing, a triumph of order over the chaos of nature, and the Pont d'Orléans was a masterpiece. It rested on 19 great pointed arches, their feet planted deep in the riverbed, creating a rhythm of stone and water that had endured for centuries. Upon the bridge itself, life had clustered like barnacles on a ship's hull. There were houses, shops, and even a small chapel dedicated to Saint Antoine, clinging to the edges of the causeway. But as the winter of 1428 approached, these structures were being systematically hollowed out, the families moving their bedding and cookpots behind the safety of the main city walls. The bridge ended on the southern bank, the Sologne side not in a simple ramp, but in a fortress. This was Les Tourelles, a grim twin-towered gatehouse of formidable strength, standing like a bouncer at the door of a very exclusive club. It was connected to the shore by a drawbridge and surrounded by earthworks, a hard knot of resistance that the English would have to crack if they wanted to shut the city's back door. Beyond Les Tourelles lay the suburb of Portereau, a pleasant district of monasteries and vineyards that the defenders were now heart-breakingly dismantling. It is a strange paradox of siege warfare that the first destruction is often self-inflicted. To deny the English cover, the people of Orléans had to torch their own history. Imagine the smell of burning oak and ancient plaster as the Augustinian friary and the church of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc were stripped and scorched. It was an amputation to save the body, performed without anaesthetic. Inside the city walls, the atmosphere was a peculiar blend of dread and defiant bustling. Orléans was not a military camp by nature. It was a city of lawyers, merchants and students, a place where the University of Orléans usually buzzed with arguments about Roman law rather than ballistics. But necessity is a harsh tutor. The citizens began to inventory their lives. They counted barrels of salted herring, sacks of wheat, and casks of the local wine, which, to be fair, was considered rather rough by the snobs in Paris, but in a siege, even a sour vintage tastes like nectar. The city council, the échevins, worked with a frantic sort of energy, hiring mercenaries and repairing the crumbling sections of the wall. There is a dark humour in the records of their meetings. Even as the apocalypse marched toward them, they were meticulous about receipts. If the world was ending, the paperwork at least would be in order. The city was technically the property of Charles, Duke of Orléans, but he was absent, a prisoner in England since the disaster of Agincourt 13 years earlier. He was a poet prince, spending his long captivity writing melancholy verses about lost love and distant springs, while his city prepared to bleed for him. His absence left a void that was filled by his half-brother, Jean de Dunois, known to history as the Bastard of Orléans. We have not met him yet in the flesh, but his presence was felt in the sharpening of swords and the reinforcing of gates. He was the illegitimate son of the previous duke, a man of immense capability who carried the defence of the family name like a shield. The relationship between the citizens and the garrison was tense, as it always is when hungry soldiers are quartered in cramped houses. A soldier needs bread, wine, and fire, and he rarely asks permission for any of them. Yet a shared fear binds people tighter than love ever could. They looked to the north, across the flat, harvest-stripped plains of the Beauce, watching for the glitter of the enemy. The Beauce is an ocean of wheat in the summer, but in November it is a desolate, wind-scoured table. It offers no hiding place. When the English finally appeared, they did not come as a horde, but as a moving city of their own. The chroniclers described the train of wagons stretching for miles, the heavy plodding of oxen dragging the great siege guns, the banners snapping in the biting wind. Leading them was Thomas Montague, the Earl of Salisbury. He was the most feared English commander alive, a man whose reputation arrived in a room 5 minutes before he did. Historians often debate the rules of war in this period, wondering if they were ever truly followed, but Salisbury was known to be ruthlessly efficient rather than wantonly cruel. He did not burn for the sake of burning, but he would starve a city of 30,000 people without missing a meal himself. As his army set up camp on the southern bank, seizing the ruins of the Portereau, the reality of the siege settled over Orléans like a heavy wool blanket. The noise of the city changed. The church bells, which usually rang the hours of prayer, now rang the alarms of watch shifts. The laughter of the taverns grew sharper, more manic. The smell of the river, mud, rotting reeds and cold water, mixed with the smell of slow-burning charcoal and fear. But there was also a strange, quiet beauty in the waiting. At twilight, the sun would dip below the flat horizon, painting the Loire in streaks of violet and bruised orange. The stone of the cathedral would glow briefly, as if holding an inner fire before the long night swallowed it. In these moments, the people of Orléans would stand on their ramparts and look out at the English campfires flickering in the distance, thousands of tiny stars that had fallen to earth to encircle them. They were an island in a sea of enemies, and in the centre of the river, the bridge stood silent and empty, the shops shuttered, the chapel dark, waiting for the first footfall of the attack that would decide the fate of France. The silence was not peace. It was the deep breath a diver takes before plunging into the dark. The arrival of the English army was not a chaotic flood, but a marvel of grim engineering. On October 12th, 1428, the main body of Salisbury's forces appeared on the southern horizon, a slow-moving forest of pikes and standards that seemed to drain the colour from the landscape. To the citizens peering nervously over the parapets of Orléans, the sheer competence of the enemy was the most terrifying thing of all. These were not undisciplined raiders looking for quick plunder. These were veterans of Agincourt and Verneuil, men who treated war with the dull, methodical patience of a bricklayer building a wall. Salisbury did not hurl his men at the main city gates in a suicidal wave. He knew that the walls of Orléans, reinforced with new artillery towers and manned by desperate militias, were too tough to crack with a single blow. Instead, he looked at the map and pointed a gauntleted finger at the southern bridgehead. He understood that if he could seize Les Tourelles, the fortress guarding the southern end of the bridge, he could aim his cannon straight down the city's throat. And so, the iron necklace began to take shape. This was not a continuous trench line, as in the wars of the 20th century, for the English army was actually surprisingly small, perhaps only 4,000 or 5,000 fighting men, hardly enough to fully encircle a city with a perimeter of several miles. Historians have long debated the wisdom of this. Some argue Salisbury was arrogant, believing he could strangle Orléans with a skeleton crew, while others suggest he simply had no choice, his manpower stretched thin by the occupation of half of France. Regardless of the numbers, they set to work with terrifying speed. The English soldiers became labourers, digging earth, felling trees, and erecting a series of bastilles, miniature wooden fortresses that acted as choke points. It is a strange psychological torture to watch your enemy build a house on your front lawn. The sounds of construction, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of mallets, the sawing of timber, the shouts of foremen drifted across the river, mixing with the ringing of the Angelus bells in the city. It was a clash of two rhythms, the sacred cycle of prayer inside and the industrial cycle of siegecraft outside. The English focused their fury on the Tourelles. They dug mines, tunnels braced with wood, underneath the outer earthworks, setting fires to collapse the ground and bring the walls down. On October 21st, they launched a ferocious assault. The fighting was ugly and intimate, a scrum of men in heavy plate armour grappling in the mud of the riverbank. The French garrison, led by the brave but overwhelmed Raoul de Gaucourt, fought with the frantic energy of men who know there is nowhere to run. But the English pressure was relentless. They were like a heavy tide that simply refused to recede. By October 24th, the defenders realised the position was untenable. They made the agonising decision to abandon the Tourelles, but they could not leave it intact for the English. In a final act of defiance, they retreated across the bridge and smashed the arches behind them. The bridge was now severed. The English held the fortress on the south bank, raising their standards triumphantly over the twin towers. The French were trapped on the north bank, staring back at their own lost gate. The river swirled between them, an impassable no-man's land. Now the true siege began. Salisbury, satisfied with capturing the bridgehead, moved to tighten the noose. He ordered the construction of a massive headquarters in the ruins of the Augustinian convent on the south bank, turning a place of prayer into a nexus of war. The English artillery was wheeled into position. These were not the sleek cannons of later centuries, but monstrous hoop-iron beasts that looked like beer barrels welded together. They fired stone balls, some as heavy as a small sheep, that smashed into the rooftops of Orléans with the force of a meteor. The psychological impact was immense. A cannonball didn't just kill, it erased. It could punch through a house, shattering the timber frame and burying a family in rubble while they sat at dinner. The randomness of it was what gnawed at the nerves. You could be a brave knight or a washerwoman. The stone ball did not care. It was the democratization of death. Yet amidst the terror, life in the city took on a surreal, almost humorous normalcy. The French, with their irrepressible spirit, began to give the English cannons nicknames. There was one particularly loud bombard they called the passe volant, a sort of oversized bully of a gun. The citizens would jeer when it missed and cheer ironically when it fired. A way of shrinking the monster down to a manageable size. Humour is the armour of the powerless, but the English strategy was working. By controlling the south bank and the bridgehead, and by building forts to the west and east, Salisbury was slowly pinching off the supply lines. The iron necklace was not yet a complete circle. There were still gaps to the northeast, where a daring rider could slip through with a sack of grain, but the links were being forged one by one. The river, once the city's lifeline, was becoming its jailer. The weather turned crueler as November approached. The mud froze into jagged ruts that twisted ankles and broke wagon wheels. The English soldiers in their bastilles shivered in their wool tunics, complaining as English soldiers have done since the dawn of time about the damp, the food, and the lack of decent ale. It is worth remembering that the besiegers suffer almost as much as the besieged. Disease does not respect uniforms. Dysentery began to whisper through the English camp, a silent killer more efficient than any French arrow. But Salisbury remained the iron pivot of the operation. He was everywhere, riding the perimeter, inspecting the earthworks, calculating angles of fire. He was the architect of Orléans' doom. The city felt his gaze like a physical weight. The defenders knew that as long as Salisbury lived, the noose would keep tightening. He was the mind and the will of the invasion. If Orléans was to survive, something had to break the pattern, something unforeseen and chaotic. And as it happened, chaos was already loading a cannon on the city walls, preparing to fire a shot that would echo through the centuries, proving that even the most carefully laid plans of earls and kings are subject to the blind, tumbling dice of fate. The date was Sunday, October 24th, 1428, a day that began with the crisp, deceptive brightness of late autumn. In the newly captured fortress of Les Tourelles, the Earl of Salisbury was a man who felt the weight of destiny resting comfortably on his shoulders. He had done the impossible. He had cracked the hard shell of the city's defences in less than a week. Now, the English commander stood within the very towers his enemies had built, turning their own architecture against them. It is said that he climbed to the second or third floor of the gatehouse, accompanied by a small retinue of captains, to survey the prize that would soon be his. The view from the window was magnificent and terrifyingly intimate. Across the broken span of the bridge, the city of Orléans lay spread out like a map. He could see the frantic movements of the defenders on the walls, the smoke rising from the chimneys, perhaps even the pale faces of citizens peering back at him. It is a strange intimacy in siege warfare, where enemies live within shouting distance of one another, sharing the same weather, the same sunrise, and the same river, yet separated by an invisible wall of lethal intent. Salisbury was reportedly in high spirits. He pointed out weak spots in the masonry, discussing where the next bombardment should focus, behaving like a landlord inspecting a property he had already purchased but not yet moved into. He did not wear his helmet. Why would he? The fighting for the day had paused. It was Sunday, a day of truce and prayer, or at least a day when the rhythms of war slowed to a heavy pulse. But across the water, on the immense stone walls of Orléans, the concept of a truce was lost on the machinery of the new age. High atop the Tour Notre Dame, a defensive tower overlooking the bridge, sat a French cannon. It was a culverin, a long, slender gun compared to the fat bombards, designed for range and precision, though precision in 1428 was a relative term. The story of who fired the shot has blurred into legend, drifting between fact and folklore like smoke. Chroniclers love to tell us that the master gunner, a man named Maître Jean, was actually away at dinner, enjoying a rare moment of peace and a warm bowl of stew. In his absence, the story goes, a young boy, perhaps his son or a bored page, wandered up to the gun. Seeing a cluster of expensive-looking armour in the window of the Tourelles across the river, the boy decided, with the reckless curiosity of youth, to apply the match to the touch-hole. Historians still argue whether this is a romantic fabrication designed to humiliate the English, the greatest lord in the land killed by a child playing with fire, or a genuine account of the randomness of war. Whether it was a master gunner or a mischievous boy, the result was the same. The cannon roared. It coughed a cloud of sulphurous smoke into the blue sky and sent a stone ball hurling across the river. It did not strike Salisbury directly. The physics of the tragedy were crueler than that. The ball smashed into the stone casing of the window where the Earl was standing. It shattered the masonry with explosive force, sending a jagged spray of stone shrapnel and iron bars flying inward. The debris struck Salisbury with horrific violence, tearing away half of his face and crushing his jaw. He did not die immediately. In a testament to the grim durability of the medieval warrior, he remained conscious, carried by his horrified lieutenants to the nearby town of Meung-sur-Loire. He lingered for a week in agonizing silence, unable to issue orders, before finally succumbing on November 3rd. The irony was heavy enough to sink a ship. The master of modern siege warfare had been undone by the very technology he championed. The death of Salisbury was not just the loss of a man, it was the loss of a mind. The English army was suddenly decapitated. The momentum that had driven them across France, the terrifying certainty of their advance, evaporated in an instant. Command devolved to a committee of nobles who, while brave, lacked Salisbury's singular, ruthless vision. There was William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, a man of great lineage but cautious temperament. There was Lord Talbot, the English Achilles, a warrior of immense personal courage, who preferred the clash of swords to the dull mathematics of starvation. And there was Lord Scales, a capable veteran. But a committee cannot lead a siege. They bickered. They hesitated. They looked at the map and saw difficulties where Salisbury had seen opportunities. The aggressive plan to storm the city across the river was shelved. Instead, they settled into a more passive strategy. They would starve Orléans into submission. The iron necklace would be built, but slowly. The urgency drained out of the English camp, replaced by a sullen determination to simply outwait the winter. For the defenders inside Orléans, the news of Salisbury's death was a miracle, a divine signal that God had not completely forgotten them. They rang the church bells in a different key that night. Yet the relief was short-lived. A slow death is still a death. The siege settled into a grinding routine, a phony war of small skirmishes and long freezing nights. The winter of 1428 deepened, clamping down on the Loire Valley with teeth of ice. The river began to freeze in patches, creating treacherous shifting plates of ice that clattered against the bridge piers. Inside the city, the cold was an enemy that armour could not deflect. Firewood became as precious as gold. Families huddled together in the drafty upper rooms of their timber-framed houses, burning furniture to stay warm. The psychological toll of the siege began to manifest in strange ways. To keep spirits up, the city hired musicians to play on the walls, trumpeters and drummers blasting defiant tunes at the English across the fields. The English, not to be outdone, played back. It became a bizarre battle of the bands, a concert played over a field of frozen mud and corpses. Soldiers on both sides would sometimes shout insults or, surprisingly, exchange pleasantries during lulls. There are accounts of English and French pages meeting in the no-man's land to trade food. English cheese for French wine, a black market of survival that operated beneath the official hatred. But the hunger was real. The inventory lists of the city began to shrink. The Gros d'Orléans, the standard loaf of bread, became smaller, darker, and harder. Cats and dogs began to disappear from the alleys, ending up in stew pots where few questions were asked. The mood shifted from panic to a dull, grey endurance, and amidst this freezing purgatory, the artillery duel continued, a slow, rhythmic thumping that became the heartbeat of the city. The French gunners, emboldened by their lucky shot against Salisbury, became experts at sniping with their cannons. They learned to calculate the arc of fire required to drop a stone ball onto the roof of an English bastille. The English returned the favour, targeting the windmills on the city walls that ground the grain. It was a war of attrition, a contest to see who would run out of resources first, the city out of food or the English out of patience. The citizens of Orléans felt a profound sense of isolation. The king, Charles VII, was in Chinon, miles away, wrapped in his own paralysis. Rumours swirled that he was considering fleeing to Scotland or Spain, abandoning the north entirely. The people of Orléans felt like passengers on a sinking ship, watching the captain lower the last lifeboat for himself. They were alone. The world had narrowed to the stone walls, the frozen river, and the ring of English forts that glowed with watchfires in the long dark nights. They did not know that the gears of history were already turning in a remote village on the edge of the kingdom, that a different kind of fire was being kindled, not in a cannon, but in the heart of a girl who had never seen a map, never held a sword, and never learned to read. But for now, there was only the cold, the hunger, and the empty horizon. By February 1429, the siege had settled into a grim rhythm of endurance, a staring contest between two starving armies played out across a landscape of frozen mud. The novelty of the iron necklace had worn off, replaced by the gnawing reality of the calendar. Lent was approaching, the 40 days of fasting before Easter, when the consumption of meat was forbidden by the church. In the medieval world, the spiritual calendar dictated the logistics of war, and this religious obligation set the stage for one of the most bizarre and tragic encounters of the entire conflict. The English army, encamped in their freezing bastilles, needed food that would not damn their souls, and so, from the English-held capital of Paris, a massive supply convoy set out to feed the besiegers. It was led by Sir John Fastolf, a veteran commander, whose name Shakespeare would later borrow and twist into the rotund Falstaff, though the real man was lean, sharp, and decidedly competent. His convoy consisted of some 300 wagons loaded with munitions, crossbow bolts, and crucially, barrels upon barrels of salted herring. It was a caravan of fish destined for the front lines. The French commanders inside Orléans and the nearby town of Blois saw this plodding line of wagons not as a grocery run, but as a target. If they could smash the convoy, the English army would starve, Lent or no Lent. A plan was hatched, one that on paper looked brilliant. A French force, led by the young aristocratic Count of Clermont, would link up with a contingent of Scottish allies, fierce fighters from the Highlands and Lowlands who hated the English with a genetic passion, led by Sir John Stewart of Darnley. They would trap Fastolf on the flat plains of the Beauce, crushing the wagons between them like a nut in a cracker. On the morning of February 12th, the trap was sprung near the tiny village of Rouvray-Saint-Denis. The terrain here was a featureless ocean of white, the snow-covered fields offering no cover for miles. Fastolf, seeing the enemy dust cloud on the horizon, realized he could not outrun them. He did not panic. Instead, he ordered a maneuver that anticipated the wagon circles of the American West by 4 centuries. He commanded his men to arrange the 300 wagons into a triangular fortification, a laager. They spiked the wheels into the frozen earth and filled the gaps with sharp stakes and archers. Inside this wooden island, the English pages and non-combatants huddled among the herring barrels, while the longbowmen nocked their arrows and waited. The French and Scots arrived, their breath steaming in the frigid air, confident in their numbers. They had something Fastolf did not: artillery. They wheeled their culverins into range and began to pound the static wooden fort. It was working. The cannonballs smashed into the wagons, shattering wheels and splintering timber. Barrels burst open, sending thousands of salted herrings spilling onto the snow, a surreal confetti of silver fish amidst the violence. The English were trapped, taking heavy fire, unable to reciprocate. If the French had simply sat back and continued the bombardment, the convoy would have surrendered or been blown to pieces. But war is rarely rational, especially when honour and impatience are involved. The Scottish commander, Sir John Stuart, was a man of action, not a mathematician. He grew restless, watching the cannons do the work. Perhaps he felt that shelling a stationary enemy lacked glory, or perhaps he simply misunderstood the battle plan. Against the frantic shouts of the French commanders to hold his ground, Stuart ordered his men to dismount and charge. It was a fatal, gallant error. The Scots surged forward on foot, their heavy boots crunching through the snow, swords drawn. But by advancing, they did two terrible things. They blocked the line of sight for their own artillery, forcing the French gunners to cease fire, and they walked straight into the killing zone of the English longbows. Fastolf, watching from behind a barricade of fish barrels, saw the reprieve. "Now!" he must have shouted. The English archers rose, the air filled with the terrifying thwack, thwack, thwack of yew-bows releasing their tension. The Scots were cut down in droves. Seeing their allies falter, the English men-at-arms leaped over the wagon chains and counter-attacked. The rout was absolute. Stuart was killed. The Count of Clermont, who had remained mounted and prudent, as a polite historical term for cowardly, in the rear, decided the day was lost and fled the field, leaving the foot soldiers to be slaughtered. The snow at Rouvray was stained red and silver, blood and herring scales mixing in a gruesome slush. The survivors limped back to Orléans, carrying the news of a disaster that was both humiliating and total. They had outnumbered the escort. They had the element of surprise. They had the guns. And they had lost to a wall of fish wagons. History, with its dark sense of irony, christened it the Battle of the Herrings. But inside Orléans, no one was laughing. The defeat was a psychological sledgehammer. It wasn't just that they had lost men, it was the way they had lost them, through incompetence, disunity, and the sheer seeming invincibility of the English. The citizens watched the remnants of the army return, heads hung low, the Count of Clermont riding swiftly away to avoid the jeers of the populace. The blame game began immediately. The French blamed the Scots for being rash. The Scots blamed the French for being cowardly. The alliance fractured. Morale collapsed. It felt as though God himself was mocking them, allowing their last hope to be dismantled by a supply train. The city leaders, the échevins, looked at their own dwindling granaries and then at the English lines, where the soldiers were now feasting on the captured herring, toasting their victory with fresh wine. Hope is a fragile currency, and in Orléans, the treasury was now empty. People began to speak openly of surrender, not to the English, that was too bitter, but perhaps to someone else, anyone else. The silence in the streets was heavy, the silence of a patient who has been told there is no cure. But far away in the town of Vaucouleurs, the disaster at Rouvray-Saint-Denis served a different purpose. It is said that on the very day of the battle, February 12th, the peasant girl Joan burst into the chamber of the local governor, Robert de Baudricourt. She had been pestering him for an escort to the king, and he had been laughing her off. But on this day, her voice was different. She told him that the Dauphin's arms had suffered a great reverse that day near Orléans, and that worse would follow if she were not sent to him. When the official news of the defeat finally arrived in Vaucouleurs, days later, confirming her impossible knowledge, the governor's laughter died in his throat. The Battle of the Herrings, a tactical farce of fish and failure, became the catalyst that finally opened the door for the Maid. It was the darkest hour, the moment when human competence had demonstrably failed, leaving room for something else, something irrational, mystical, and dangerous to step into the void. But the people of Orléans did not know this yet. They only knew that the fish had won, the Scots were dead, and the end was coming. Following the humiliation of the Battle of the Herrings, the mood inside Orléans shifted from anxiety to a hollow, ringing despair. It was March 1429, and the city felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb, with the door left slightly ajar. The defeat had shattered the garrison's faith in their military leaders. The Count of Clermont had ridden away in disgrace, taking with him the illusion that professional soldiers could save them. The citizens were now left with a terrifying clarity. The English were not going to leave, and the French crown was too weak to make them leave. Faced with the prospect of starvation and the inevitable sack of the city, a horror that would involve looting, burning, and violence on a scale the mind refused to contemplate, the burghers of Orléans decided to play their final card. It was a card of desperation, a diplomatic gambit that sought to exploit the cracks in the enemy alliance. If they could not defeat the English, perhaps they could surrender to someone else. It sounds absurd to modern ears, like a shopper trying to return a defective item to a different store, but in the complex web of feudal law, it had a certain logic. Orléans was the personal property of Charles, Duke of Orléans, who had been a prisoner in England for 14 years. By the codes of chivalry, which were fading but still theoretically binding, it was considered bad form to attack the lands of a prisoner who could not defend himself. Using this moral loophole, the city council drafted a proposal to surrender the city not to the English regent, the Duke of Bedford, but to his ally, Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. A delegation of high-ranking citizens and soldiers, led by the rugged captain Poton de Saint-Treize, rode out under a flag of truce. They travelled north to the town of Montereau, and then potentially on to Paris, to lay their city at the feet of the Duke of Burgundy. The offer was clever. Philip of Burgundy was a cousin of the French royal family, a man who played both sides of the chessboard. If Orléans surrendered to him, the city would be placed in sequestration, held in a neutral trust until the war was over. The citizens would be spared the English sword, and the English would still technically achieve their goal of neutralising the fortress. It was a face-saving exit for everyone. Philip, tempted by the prospect of adding another jewel to his already glittering collection of territories, was inclined to accept. He saw himself as the great arbiter of the realm, and taking Orléans without firing a shot would be a masterstroke of statecraft. However, the decision was not his alone. He had to convince his ally, the English regent John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, and so the scene shifts to a tense council chamber in Paris, where the fate of the city was debated, not with cannons but with metaphors. Bedford was the brother of the late Henry V, a capable, serious administrator who had spent years grinding down French resistance. He had paid for the siege of Orléans with English gold and English blood. He had lost his best commander, Salisbury, to that stray cannonball. The idea that he should now step aside and let the Duke of Burgundy catch the prize was infuriating. When Philip presented the proposal, suggesting that Orléans be handed over to him as a neutral territory, Bedford's reaction was icy and immediate. He looked at his Burgundian ally and delivered a line that has echoed through history with the sharp snap of a closing trap. "I should be very sorry," Bedford reportedly sneered, "to have beaten the bushes, only so that others might catch the birds." It was a brutal rejection. He was telling Philip that the English had done the hard work, the beating of the bushes, the digging of trenches, the dying in the mud, and they intended to eat the birds themselves. Bedford refused the offer of sequestration outright. He demanded unconditional surrender to England, or nothing. The meeting dissolved in acrimony. Philip the Good was a proud man, one of the wealthiest and most powerful grandees in Europe, and he did not take kindly to being treated like a junior partner or a scavenger. The consequences of this diplomatic failure were profound and immediate. Though perhaps not in the way Bedford intended, Philip, stung by the insult, ordered his Burgundian troops to withdraw from the siege of Orléans. While the English provided the bulk of the forces, the Burgundians had manned key sections of the blockade, particularly on the northern and western approaches. When they packed up their tents and marched away in a huff, they left gaping holes in the iron necklace. The English, already stretched thin, were forced to spread their men even wider to cover the abandoned positions or simply leave them empty. This crucial weakening of the siege line meant that the blockade was never truly hermetic. There were always gaps through which a daring messenger, or a supply wagon, or a peasant girl could slip. Bedford's pride had inadvertently made the city porous, but back in Orléans the citizens did not yet realize this strategic silver lining. All they knew was that the delegation had returned with ashes in their mouths. The news spread through the narrow streets like a cold wind. Burgundy could not save them. The English had refused to compromise. There would be no neutral peace, no gentle surrender. The choice was now binary and terrifying, death or victory. And since victory seemed impossible, death appeared to be the only appointment left on the calendar. The psychological impact of the Burgundy gambit failing was the final stripping away of illusions. The city was now truly alone. They had looked to the king, and he was paralyzed. They had looked to the army, and it had been crushed by fish wagons. They had looked to diplomacy, and it had been shattered by an English duke's greed. There were no more cards to play. The city elders sat in their guild halls, staring at the flicker of candles, silent and exhausted. The food stocks were critically low. The spring was coming, but it promised only a renewed English offensive. In this vacuum of hope, the collective mind of the city began to fracture. When you have exhausted the possible, you inevitably turn to the impossible. The soil of their despair was now perfectly tilled for something supernatural to take root. They did not know it, but the rejection by Bedford was the final necessary condition for what was to come. If the city had surrendered to Burgundy, the war would have ended in a grey compromise, and the girl from Domremy would have remained a footnote, a peasant spinning wool in a forgotten village. But because the door was slammed shut, the path was cleared for the miraculous. The stage was empty. The lights were dimmed. The audience was terrified. And far to the east, walking through the muddy roads of Lorraine with a small band of knights who were beginning to believe her crazy stories, the protagonist was finally approaching the curtain. The failure of the politicians had cleared the way for the prophet. Let us leave the stone walls of Orléans and the muddy trenches of the siege for a moment. We must travel east, across the scarred landscape of France, to the very edge of the kingdom, to the village of Domremy. It is a place that feels forgotten by the great gears of history, a cluster of houses huddled near the Meuse River, surrounded by the thick whispering canopy of the oak woods. Here the war is a distant rumble, a story told by travelling merchants, though occasionally the reality of it spills over in the form of Burgundian raiders driving cattle through the streets. In this quiet rural world, we find a girl named Johanna, or, as history has anglicised her, Joan. It is 1425, 3 years before the siege, and she is 13 years old. She is not a princess in disguise, nor a mystic living in a cave. She is remarkably disarmingly ordinary. She spins wool. She helps her father, Jacques d'Arc, a peasant farmer of some standing, with the animals. She is known in the village for being perhaps a little too pious, the kind of girl who kneels in the church when others are dancing on the green. But otherwise, she is woven into the fabric of peasant life. But there is a thread in that fabric that glows with a strange light. One summer day, around noon, in her father's garden, the air changes. It is not a wind, but a stillness, a heaviness that presses against the ears. She sees a light on the right side, towards the church, and hears a voice. At first, she is terrified. The voice is not inside her head. It comes from without, as real as the church bells. It belongs to the Archangel Michael, the commander of the heavenly hosts, the warrior angel who battles dragons. Later, he is joined by St. Catherine and St. Margaret, two virgin martyrs whose statues she would have known from the local church. These are not vague, ethereal spirits to her. She claims to see them, to smell them, to touch the hem of their robes. They speak to her with a terrifying specificity. At first, the messages are simple. Be a good girl. Go to church. But as she grows, the voices grow with her, their commands becoming more urgent, more political, more impossible. You must go into France, they whisper. You must lift the siege of Orléans. You must crown the king. Imagine the burden of this secret. For years, Joan carries a universe inside her chest while scrubbing floors and mending tunics. She is a teenager, holding a grenade of divine purpose. The tension between her reality and her destiny is excruciating. She tries to resist. I am a poor girl. I do not know how to ride or fight, she tells the voices. But the voices are relentless. They do not care about her lack of training. They care about her obedience. The situation in France deteriorates. Orléans is besieged. Salisbury arrives. The iron necklace tightens, and the voices become a shout. Go, daughter of God, go. The timing is no coincidence. As the earthly powers fail, the heavenly mandate intensifies. She can no longer stay in the garden. She must step onto the road. Her first obstacle is not the English army, but her own family. Her father has a dream that she runs away with soldiers, a nightmare for any medieval parent, and declares he would rather drown her with his own hands than see her dishonoured. So she has to lie. In January 1429, she convinces her uncle to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, ostensibly to help his wife in childbirth. It is her first military manoeuvre, a deception to gain freedom. In Vaucouleurs, she confronts the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt. He is a rough, cynical soldier, a man who deals in iron and stone, not visions. When this peasant girl, in a red dress, walks in and demands an escort to the king, he laughs. He tells her uncle to box her ears and take her home. It is the reaction of the rational world meeting the irrational. But Joan does not leave. She stays in the town, living with a wheelwright's family, going to mass, and speaking to anyone who will listen. Her conviction is magnetic. The people of Vaucouleurs begin to murmur. They see something in her, not madness, but a terrifying sanity. She speaks of the King of Heaven with the familiarity of a courtier. Then comes the moment we touched upon earlier, the day of the Battle of the Herrings. She bursts in on Baudricourt again, her voice ringing with the authority of the voices. The king has suffered a great defeat this day, she warns. Send me, or there will be no France left. When the news of the disaster confirms her words, Baudricourt's scepticism cracks. It is the breach in the wall she needs. He gives her a sword and an escort of 6 men. But before she leaves, a profound transformation occurs. The people of Vaucouleurs, moved by her piety and perhaps desperate for a miracle, chip in to buy her men's clothing. She cuts her hair short, en équelle, bowl cut, like a soldier. She puts on the tunic, the hose, the boots. This is not just practical, it is a shedding of her old self. She is leaving behind the gender roles that bind her, becoming a creature of pure function. She's no longer just a girl, she is a vessel. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon is a ride through the valley of the shadow of death. It is 300 miles of enemy territory, infested with English patrols and Burgundian brigands. They ride at night, sleeping in ditches, moving like ghosts through the winter landscape. Her companions, hardened soldiers like Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy are initially suspicious. They wonder if she is a witch or a madwoman. They even consider throwing her down a well to be rid of the problem. But as the nights wear on, they are changed by her. They watch her sleep in her armour, exhausted but peaceful, and they feel a strange protection radiating from her. They stop swearing in her presence. They begin to believe. It is the first miracle of Joan, the conversion of the cynical. They arrive at Chinon in late February 1429. The castle looms above the Vienne River, a massive complex of stone where Charles VII is hiding from the world. Joan has reached the heart of the kingdom. She has survived the road. Now she must survive the court. She stands before the gates, a peasant in men's clothes, claiming to have the phone number of God. The guards look at her, then at each other. Inside, the king is debating whether to let her in. It is the moment where the two halves of the story, the desperate siege and the mystical relief, are about to collide. The girl from the oak woods is about to step out of the trees and into the throne room. The arrival of Joan at the Château de Chinon in late February 1429 was not a royal procession. It was a collision between two alien worlds. On one side stood the rigid, cynical, and terrified apparatus of the French court, a place where rumours were currency and betrayal was a hobby. On the other stood a teenage girl in muddy men's clothes, smelling of horse sweat and the open road, carrying nothing but a terrifying sincerity. She did not walk immediately into the king's presence. For 2 days, she was kept waiting in the town below the castle, lodged with a respectable woman, while the royal council debated her fate. You can imagine the arguments in the stone corridors. "She is a witch," whispered the clerics. "She is a spy," muttered the generals. "She is a lunatic," sighed the courtiers, who had seen plenty of mad mystics come and go, promising to turn lead into gold or water into wine. The court of Charles VII was a desperate place, a kingdom of Bourges, where the silk tapestries were fraying and the treasury was so empty, the king sometimes had to pawn his jewellery to buy dinner. They were not in the market for false hope. They could barely afford the real kind. But curiosity, and perhaps the sheer bleakness of their situation, won out. If the English were winning because God was on their side, perhaps France needed a hotline to the divine to counterbalance the scales. On the evening of her audience, the great hall of Chinon was packed. The scene was set with deliberate theatricality. 300 knights and courtiers were crammed into the room, dressed in their finest velvets and furs, a shimmering wall of aristocracy designed to intimidate a peasant girl into silence. The air would have been thick with the smoke of 50 torches, the smell of roasted meat, and the heavy perfume used to mask the less pleasant odours of medieval hygiene. It was a sensory assault. Charles VII, the Dauphin, decided to test this messenger of God. He was a man defined by his insecurities, physically unimposing, with sad, heavy-lidded eyes, and a nose that seemed too large for his face. He was not a warrior king like Henry V. He was a thinker, a worrier, a man who lay awake at night wondering if he was truly the son of the late king or the bastard product of his mother's infamous affairs. If he was a bastard, he had no right to the throne, and the war was a lie. To test Joan, he removed his royal insignia and mingled with the crowd of courtiers, hiding in plain sight. He placed a different man on the throne, dressed in royal robes, acting as a decoy. It was a cruel parlour game. Find the king. When Joan entered the hall, the murmur of the crowd died instantly. She was small, dark-haired, and dressed in a simple black and grey tunic. She did not look at the floor. She did not cower. She walked through the press of bodies with the focus of a hawk. She glanced briefly at the impostor on the throne, ignored him entirely, and walked straight to the man standing in the shadows of the crowd. She knelt before Charles. "God give you life, gentle king," she said, her voice clear and startlingly young in the hushed room. Charles, perhaps trying to maintain the ruse, or simply stunned, pointed to the decoy. "I am not the king, Joan," he said. "There is the king." Joan did not blink. "In the name of God, it is you, and no other," she replied. A ripple of shock went through the room. The parlour game was over. The girl had seen through the mask, but a party trick was not enough to hand over command of the armies. Charles, intrigued, but still cautious, led her away from the crowd into a window recess for a private conversation. What happened next is one of the great mysteries of history. The courtiers, watching from a distance, saw a transformation come over their king. He had walked into the corner, a slumped, defeated man. He emerged minutes later with his face glowing, looking, as one observer noted, as if he had been visited by the Holy Spirit. Joan had whispered something to him that shattered his doubt. Historians still argue ferociously about what she said. The most prevalent theory, and the one that fits the psychological puzzle best, is that she addressed his deepest, darkest fear, his legitimacy. It is believed she told him that God had revealed to her that he was indeed the true son of the king and the rightful heir of France. Only Charles knew how deeply that doubt gnawed at him. For a stranger to name it and banish it was a proof he could not ignore. She had not just found him in a crowded room, she had found him in the lonely crowd of his own mind. Yet, the Middle Ages was a bureaucracy of the soul, and even a miracle required paperwork. Charles was convinced, but he could not risk the PR disaster of being led by a heretic or a sorceress. If Joan turned out to be a demonic plant, the English propaganda machine would tear him apart. The Witch King of Bourges was a title he could not afford. So, he hit the pause button. He ordered Joan to be taken to the city of Poitiers to be examined by a panel of the kingdom's most learned theologians. It was a grueling process. For weeks, this illiterate girl was grilled by professors of law and theology. They asked her trick questions. They tried to trip her up on dogma. "If God wishes to save France," one friar asked with a smug logic, "why does he need soldiers?" Joan's reply was sharp and perfect. "The soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory." She was simple, consistent, and surprisingly funny. When a frantic excitement seeker asked to see a sign, she retorted, "I did not come to Poitiers to show signs. Take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I was sent." She was not a mystic floating in the clouds. She was a pragmatist waiting for a permit. Back in Orléans, the siege ground on. The defenders did not know that their fate was being debated by men in comfortable robes in a library miles away. They only knew that the food was running out. But rumours began to drift through the English lines. The soldiers in the Bastilles heard whispers of a Maid of Lorraine coming to sweep them away. Superstition is the twin brother of fear. The English, who feared no knight in armour, began to look nervously at the shadows. Was God changing sides? In the medieval mind, this was a terrifying prospect. If the French had a saint, and the English only had cannons, the math of the war was about to change. Finally, in April 1429, the panel at Poitiers delivered their verdict. They found in her nothing but humility, purity, honesty, and simplicity. They declared that, given the desperate situation of Orléans, the king would be rejecting the Holy Spirit if he did not at least try her. It was a conditional yes, a calculated risk. Charles accepted it. The wait was over. The girl was unleashed. But a warrior needs weapons. Joan was provided with a suit of armour, custom made to fit her small frame, a suit of white armour, unpolished steel that shone like a mirror. She did not want a sword from the royal armoury, however. She told the king that her sword was buried behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. She had never been there, she said, but her voices told her it was there, marked with 5 crosses. The monks were sent to dig. They found a rusted ancient sword, exactly as she had described. They cleaned it, the rust reportedly falling off with miraculous ease, and sent it to her. Now she had her armour, her sword, and her king's blessing. But she needed one last thing, a standard. She designed it herself. It was white, painted with lilies, the fleur-de-lis, and depicted God holding the world, flanked by 2 angels. It was a banner not of war, but of command. She would later say she loved her banner 40 times more than her sword, for the banner led men to safety, while the sword only led them to blood. The army began to gather at Blois, a massive logistical beast waking from hibernation. Provisions were stockpiled, cattle, pigs, corn, and powder. The soldiers, a rough collection of mercenaries and tired veterans, watched with open mouths as this teenage girl rode among them. She didn't swear. She chased away the camp followers, the prostitutes and gamblers who trailed the army like a tail. She forced the men to confess their sins. It was the strangest army in the history of France, a crusade led by a child, marching to save a city that had already written its own obituary. The king of the shadows had made his move. He had bet his crown on a vision. Now, the vision had to survive the reality of English arrows. The road to Orléans was open, and the girl from Domremy was riding into the storm. The gathering of the relief army at Blois in late April 1429 was a spectacle that defied the conventions of medieval warfare. Usually, a mercenary camp was a place of gambling, drinking, and the kind of creative profanity that could peel paint off a wall. But when Joan arrived, she brought the atmosphere of a cathedral into the mud of the bivouac. She was not interested in commanding a rabble. She believed that for God to grant victory, the instrument, the army, had to be clean. She ordered the immediate expulsion of the camp followers, the legions of women who travelled with the soldiers. She banned looting, and, most shockingly to the veterans, she banned swearing. This presented a significant linguistic challenge for men like La Hire, a Gascon captain whose vocabulary was reportedly 90% blasphemy. There is a touching, slightly humorous anecdote that Joan, realizing the impossibility of complete silence, granted La Hire a special dispensation to swear by his baton, his command staff, rather than taking the Lord's name in vain. It was a compromise between sanctity and the soldiers' need to vent. The priests became as important as the pikemen. Joan organised a dedicated corps of clergy to march at the head of the column, carrying her banner and singing hymns. Imagine the visual dissonance. Thousands of hardened killers, men who had spent years burning villages and slitting throats, now marching behind a choir, awkwardly mumbling prayers. To the modern eye, it might look like a cult. To the medieval mind, it was practical technology. They were sanitizing their souls to ensure the luck of heaven. The logistics of the convoy were equally massive. It was not just an army. It was a lifeline. Orléans was starving, so the relief force had to bring the grocery store with them. Hundreds of wagons were loaded with grain, beans, and salted meat. Great herds of cattle and pigs were driven alongside the troops, a moving feast that lowed and squealed, kicking up a dust cloud that could be seen for miles. On April 27th, the strange procession set out from Blois. Joan, riding in her white armour, insisted they march along the north bank of the Loire through the Beauce region. This was the direct route. It would lead them straight to the main gates of Orléans, right through the heart of the English army. To Joan, this was the point. You go where the enemy is, and you smash them with the help of God. But the military commanders, men like the Marshal de Boussac and Gilles de Rais, a figure whose later life would descend into horrific infamy, but who was then a capable soldier, were horrified. Marching a slow, cow-laden convoy past the English heavy guns was tactical suicide. They knew the only safe way was to approach via the south bank through the Sologne, where the English presence was weaker, but they also knew Joan would never agree to a detour that smelled of caution. So they lied to her. They guided the army across the bridge at Blois and led them down the southern bank, telling Joan that this was the way to the English main force. Joan, who did not know the local geography, trusted them. The army marched for 2 days, a long, winding snake of steel and livestock, moving through the damp forests of the Sologne. It was only when they reached the heights of Chessy, a few miles east of Orléans, that the deception was revealed. Joan looked across the river and saw the city of Orléans on the other side. Between her and the gates lay the wide swollen waters of the Loire. She had been brought to the wrong bank. To make matters worse, the wind was blowing strongly from the east against the current, which meant that the supply barges from the city, which were supposed to sail upstream to meet them, were pinned against the docks. They were stuck. The scene that followed was one of the most tense interactions of the entire war. Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, the man who had been holding the city together for months, crossed the river in a small boat to meet the relief force. He was a professional, a pragmatist, and a man exhausted by 6 months of siege. He stepped onto the muddy bank and faced the teenage girl who was supposed to be his savior. Joan was furious. She didn't offer a polite greeting. "Are you the bastard of Orléans?" she demanded. "I am," Dunois replied, with a courtly bow, "and I rejoice at your coming. Did you advise that I should come here by this side of the river and not go straight to where Talbot and the English are?" "I did," Dunois admitted, "and others wiser than I gave the same counsel for the greater safety of the convoy." Joan's retort was blistering. "In God's name, the counsel of my lord is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, but you have deceived yourself, for I bring you better succour than has ever come to any knight or town, the succour of the King of Heaven." It was a clash of two realities, the logistical versus the mystical. Dunois pointed out the problem, the wind. The barges couldn't move. The food was stuck on the south bank, and the city was starving on the north. The English, seeing the French army, were already stirring in their forts. It looked like a disaster. The captains began to whisper that they should retreat to Blois. But then, a moment occurred that historians still struggle to explain without using the word miracle. While Dunois and Joan were arguing, the wind suddenly dropped, the flags stopped snapping, the trees went still. Then the breeze picked up again. But from the west, the wind had reversed. It was a meteorological impossibility for the season, a sudden 180-degree shift. The sails of the waiting barges snapped full, and they began to glide upstream against the current, easily reaching the waiting convoy. The hardened sailors and soldiers crossed themselves. Dunois, a man of iron rationality, stared at the river in disbelief. He later testified at her rehabilitation trial that this moment, more than any other, convinced him that she was not just a mascot, but a force of nature. With the wind at their backs, the logistics unlocked. The barges were loaded with the grain and the livestock. The army, however, could not cross. There were not enough boats to ferry thousands of men and horses. The captains decided the main force would have to return to Blois and cross by the bridge, there to approach from the north. The very route Joan had wanted to take in the first place. But Joan would not go back. She refused to leave the supplies. She would cross into the city with the food. It was a chaotic scene on the riverbank. Cows were being winched onto barges, Barrels of beans were rolling, knights were shouting orders. But in the centre of it all, the tension had broken. The lie of the captains had been forgiven by the miracle of the wind. Joan boarded a boat, leaving her army to the long march back, effectively stepping alone into the siege. She was crossing the threshold. As the sun began to set on April 29th, the barges pushed off, loaded with the bread that would feed the body of Orléans and the girl who would feed its soul. The water lapped against the hull, dark and cold, but the wind, that impossible, helpful wind, pushed them steadily toward the dark silhouette of the city walls. The wait was over. The maiden was coming to dinner, and she was bringing the main course. The night of April the 29th, 1429, did not fall upon Orléans. It seemed rather to erupt from the ground, illuminated by 1,000 flickering torches. The wind miracle on the river had allowed the barges to dock safely at Chessy, and the supplies were now being carted toward the city's eastern gate, the Porte de Bourgogne. This was the most vulnerable moment of the operation. To enter the city, the convoy had to pass within striking distance of the English-held Bastille of Saint-Lô. The garrison held its breath. The English soldiers, usually so aggressive, stayed behind their earthworks. Historians have long debated this strange passivity. Was it the size of the convoy that deterred them? Or was it the eerie stories they had heard about the Witch of Rome arriving to curse them? Whatever the reason, the English guns remained silent. The iron necklace gaped open, and the heart of France slipped through. Joan did not enter quietly. She waited until around 8 o'clock in the evening to make her formal entrance, allowing the darkness to amplify the drama of the torchlight. She rode a white horse, a destrier that was likely more accustomed to the tilt yard than the siege line, and she was fully armoured, save for a helmet, which she left off so the people could see her face. Carried before her was her great white standard, the fabric snapping softly in the night air. Beside her rode Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, looking less like a sceptical commander and more like a man who had just won a rigged game of dice. When the gates of the Porte de Bourgogne swung open, the sound that greeted them was physical. It was a roar of relief that had been bottling up for 6 months. The chroniclers described the scene with a kind of delirious intensity. They threw themselves upon her as if God himself had descended amongst them. The discipline of the crowd collapsed. Men, women, and children surged forward, ignoring the guards, desperate just to touch the leather of her boots, the flank of her horse, or the stirrups of her saddle. The streets of Orléans were narrow, winding canyons of stone, and they were packed so tight that the horses could barely move. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, burning pitch, and the metallic tang of joy. For a population that had been measuring out grain by the cupful and watching their neighbours die of flux, Joan was not a military strategy. She was oxygen. In the crush, a near disaster occurred that served only to heighten her mystique. A torchbearer, pushed by the swaying crowd, stumbled too close to Joan's horse. The flame caught the edge of her pennon, the long triangular flag attached to her lance. The fabric flared up. A gasp went through the crowd. To the superstitious medieval mind, a burning flag was a horrific omen, a sign that God's favour was literally going up in smoke. But Joan did not panic. She did not scream for water. With the reflexes of a seasoned squire, she spurred her horse, wheeled it around to create space, and whipped the fire out against the damp stone of a nearby house wall. It was a moment of physical competence that grounded the myth. She wasn't just a saint in a stained glass window. She was a girl who knew how to handle a horse and a crisis. The crowd cheered even louder. She was real. The procession wound its way slowly through the city, past the boarded-up shops and the dark alleys, where the shadows of starvation still lingered. She was heading for the residence of Jacques Boucher, the treasurer of the Duke of Orléans. It was a significant choice of lodging. She did not stay in the castle or a military barracks. She stayed in the home of a respected bourgeois official, embedding herself in the civilian heart of the city. The house was near the Porte Regnard, a substantial timber-framed building that offered a semblance of comfort. But comfort was not on Joan's mind. When she finally dismounted, exhausted by the day's ride and the emotional assault of the entry, she refused the banquet that had been prepared for her. The table was likely groaning with the best food the treasurer could hoard, a sacrifice for the saviour. But Joan asked only for a piece of bread and a cup of wine, mixed with plenty of water. It was a monastic meal in the middle of a celebration, a reminder that the work had not yet begun. Inside the house, the scene was surprisingly domestic. Surprisingly, Joan was introduced to Jacques Boucher's wife and his 9-year-old daughter Charlotte. There is a tenderness in the records here. Joan, who had left her own family behind, seemingly adopted this one for the duration of the siege. She insisted that Charlotte sleep in the same room with her. It is a detail that softens the iron image of the warrior, the girl who would lead charges against cannons sleeping beside a child, perhaps whispering comfort in the dark. It reminds us that she was only 17, a child herself by modern standards, carrying the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. Outside, the city could not sleep. The arrival of the supplies meant that for the first time in weeks, there would be bread in the markets the next day. But the hunger for food had been replaced by a hunger for action. The garrison soldiers, who had been sullen and defeatist, were suddenly polishing their armour. The militia were checking their crossbow strings. The psychological siege was broken. The English were still in their forts, their guns were still loaded, and the walls were still surrounded, but the equation had flipped. The defenders no longer felt like prisoners waiting for execution. They felt like an army waiting for the dawn. Across the river, in the dark bulk of the Tourelles and the ruins of the Augustins, the English watched the glow of the celebrations over the city walls. They heard the bells ringing, not the slow toll of the death knell, but the frantic, joyous peal of a festival. It must have been deeply unsettling. The English soldiers were tired, unpaid, and cold. They had been told that the French were broken, that the city was a ripe fruit ready to fall. Now, the fruit was arming itself. The arrival of the witch was a psychological blow. There were whispers in the English camp that their arrows wouldn't fly straight against her, that she could catch cannonballs in her lap. Fear is a contagion, and that night it crossed the no man's land and settled in the English trenches. Back in the house of Jacques Boucher, the lights were finally dimmed. Joan, the centre of the storm, lay down to rest. She had achieved the impossible. She had entered the sealed city. But she knew, with the terrifying clarity of her voices, that entering was the easy part. The hard part, the killing, the dying, the breaking of the ring, was yet to come. She closed her eyes, listening to the breathing of the city that she now belonged to. For the first time in 1429, Orléans did not dream of surrender. It dreamed of the morning. The days following Joan's entry into Orléans were a strange interlude of psychological warfare. The city was buzzing with a renewed energy, but the English were still firmly entrenched in their bastilles. Joan, however, did not immediately reach for her sword. Instead, she reached for a quill, or rather, she dictated to those who could use one. Before spilling blood, she was determined to offer the English a chance to leave with their lives. It was a requirement of medieval theology. You must offer peace before you wage war, lest the sin of the killing fall upon you. She composed a series of letters, known as the Letters to the English, which are masterpieces of rustic audacity. They were not written in the polite, flower-laden diplomatic French of the court. They were written in the blunt dialect of the barnyard. "King of England," she dictated, "and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the Kingdom of France, surrender to the maid the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France." She warned them that if they did not leave, she would make them leave, and that she would raise a war cry such as had not been heard in France for 1,000 years. She didn't just send letters, she delivered the message in person. On one occasion, she walked out to the end of the broken bridge on the city side, across the gap in the fortress of Les Tourelles. The English garrison was watching. The distance was short enough for a voice to carry over the water. Joan stood on the masonry, a small figure in white armour against the massive backdrop of the city walls, and shouted her ultimatum. "Surrender to the King of Heaven," she cried. "Go back to England." The English response was immediate and vicious. They did not tremble. They laughed. They shouted back insults that would make a sailor blush, calling her a cowgirl and a whore of the Armagnacs. The English commander, William Glasdale, who held the Tourelles, was particularly venomous, threatening to burn her if he ever caught her. Joan, usually so composed, was brought to tears by the crude abuse. It was a harsh reminder that to the men across the river, she was not a saint. She was a joke, a deviation, a target. But while the insults flew, the strategic reality was shifting. On May 4th, the rest of the relief army, the one that had turned back at Blois to cross the bridge, finally arrived. This time they marched in from the north, skirting the English forts. Joan rode out to meet them, her standard flying, effectively daring the English to attack. And again, the English did nothing. They watched from their bastilles as thousands of fresh French soldiers poured into the city. The iron necklace was not just broken, it was being trampled. With the arrival of these reinforcements, the balance of power inside Orléans changed irrevocably. The garrison now outnumbered the besiegers. The time for shouting across the river was over. That afternoon, Joan decided to take a nap. It seems a mundane detail, but it speaks to the exhaustion of the past few days. She lay down in her room at the treasurer's house while her squire, a young man named Daulon, dozed on a bench nearby. The city was quiet, but the quiet was a lie. Without telling Joan, the French commanders had decided to launch an attack. They targeted the Bastille of Saint-Lô, the fortress that guarded the road to the east. It was an isolated position, vulnerable now that the city was resupplied. The attack, however, began badly. The French militia, eager but undisciplined, rushed the English earthworks and were repulsed with heavy casualties. The wounded began to stream back into the city. Suddenly, Joan woke up. She sat bolt upright in bed, agitated, claiming her voices had woken her. "My counsel tells me to go against the English," she said, confused, "but I do not know if I should go to their bastilles or against Fastolf, the relief force." Then, hearing the distant noise of the skirmish, she realized what was happening. "The blood of our people is flowing," she cried. It was a rebuke to her own rest. She scrambled into her armour. In her haste, she couldn't find her banner, so her squire Daulon had to pass it to her through the window. She mounted her horse and galloped through the streets, the hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones. She was heading toward the sound of the guns. When she arrived at the Saint-Lô gate, the scene was chaotic. French soldiers were retreating, carrying limp bodies. Joan did not stop. She rode through the retreating men, her banner high. The sight of her, the girl who had just been asleep, now charging into the fray, had an instantaneous galvanic effect. The retreat stopped. Men turned around. "The maid! The maid!" The cry went up. She did not issue complex tactical orders. She simply rode toward the enemy. The French wave surged back toward the Bastille. The fighting at Saint-Lô was savage. The English garrison, seeing the renewed assault, fought desperately. They were isolated, cut off from their comrades in the other forts, but the French, emboldened by Joan's presence, swarmed over the earthworks. They filled the ditch with fascines, bundles of sticks, and leaned ladders against the wooden palisades. Joan stood near the edge of the moat, shouting encouragement, a visible anchor for the attack. For the first time in the siege, the English seemed small. They were not the invincible iron men of Agincourt. They were just men in a wooden box, surrounded by an angry sea. By evening, the Bastille of Saint-Lô had fallen. The French poured inside, killing most of the garrison. A few English prisoners were taken, but many were slaughtered in the heat of vengeance. Joan, witnessing the aftermath, wept. She had wanted victory, but the sight of dead bodies, English bodies, horrified her. She reportedly confessed to her chaplain that she had never seen French blood flow without her hair standing on end, but seeing the enemy dead was a different kind of sorrow. It was the collision of her mission with her humanity. The victory at Saint-Lô was the first domino. It proved that the English Bastilles could be taken. The psychological stranglehold was broken. That night, the church bells of Orléans rang out, not in alarm but in triumph. The citizens, who had been hiding in cellars for months, poured into the streets, but the commanders, Dunois, Gaucourt, and the others, were cautious. They wanted to pause, to consolidate. They planned to rest the next day, May 5th, which was the Feast of the Ascension, a holy day where fighting was technically forbidden. Joan agreed to the pause in fighting, but she did not agree to the pause in pressure. She spent the day firing more arrows of words, dictating a final warning to the English. She attached the letter to an arrow and had an archer fire it into the English camp. "Read this," she shouted. The English shouted back that she was a witch whore. The dialogue was over. The council of war met that evening. The captains proposed a feint, an attack on the other side of the city to draw the English out. Joan slammed her hand on the table. No feints, no tricks. She wanted to strike the heart. She pointed to the south bank, to the fortress of Les Tourelles, and the Bastille of the Augustins that guarded it. "We must break the bridgehead," she insisted. It was the hardest target, the strongest point of the English line. The captains were appalled. It was suicide, but the citizens of Orléans were on her side. The militia, the common people, had tasted victory at Saint-Lô, and they wanted more. They surrounded the house where the council was meeting, shouting for the maid. The captains, realizing they had lost control of the army's morale to a teenage girl, relented. They would attack the south bank. The next morning, May 6th, the army mustered at the Burgundy Gate. They were crossing the river not by the bridge, which was broken, but by a pontoon bridge of boats constructed further east. They were crossing the River of Fire, heading straight into the teeth of the English defence. Joan was the first to the gate. The captains tried to stop her, closing the gate to prevent the rash attack. Joan turned to the governor of the city, Raoul de Gaucourt, who was guarding the exit. "You will open it," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "or I will stir up such a trouble that you will not know where to hide." The veteran soldier looked at the girl, looked at the angry crowd behind her, and ordered the gates opened. The hinge of history groaned, and the French army poured out. The real battle was about to begin. The dawn of Friday, May 6th, 1429, broke over a river that was no longer a barrier, but a highway of war. The decision had been made. The French would not merely defend. They would cross the Loire and hunt the English on their own ground. The target was the south bank, specifically the fortified complex of Les Augustins. This was not a simple wooden fort like Saint-Lô. It was a converted monastery, a sprawling stone labyrinth of cloisters and chapels that the English had fortified with earthworks and artillery. It stood as the protective shield for the main prize, Les Tourelles. To take the bridge, the French first had to take the monastery. The logistics of the crossing were frantic. Since the great stone bridge was broken, the citizens of Orléans had constructed a bridge of boats, a swaying, creaking pontoon structure anchored to the Ile Saint-Aignan, a sandbar island in the middle of the river. Imagine the sensory overload of that morning. The mist was rising off the Loire, mixing with the smoke of the previous day's battle. Thousands of men were funneling onto the narrow pontoon bridge, their armour clanking, horses whinnying in protest at the unstable footing. The water churned beneath them, dark and indifferent. Joan was among the first to cross, her white banner bobbing above the steel stream like a navigational buoy. She landed on the muddy southern bank, the Sologne side, where the ground was scarred by months of siegecraft. But as the French vanguard formed up, the ghost of Agincourt, that old, hereditary fear of the English, returned to haunt them. The French plan was to bypass the smaller English outpost of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and strike directly at the Augustins. But the English garrison at Saint-Jean, seeing the massive force arriving, wisely abandoned their position and fell back to the stronger walls of the Augustins. The French soldiers, seeing the enemy retreat, let out a cheer and surged forward. It was a disorderly rush, a mob rather than an army. They ran straight toward the monastery walls, expecting another easy victory like Saint-Lô. They were wrong. The English, waiting at the Augustins, were elite troops, and they were cornered. As the breathless French infantry arrived at the earthworks, the English roared out in a counterattack. A wave of longbowmen and men-at-arms poured out of the monastery gates. Weapons swinging, the shock was immediate. The French, disorganized and winded, crumpled. The cheer turned into a scream. The front ranks broke, and the panic rippled backward with terrifying speed. Retreat! Retreat to the boats! The cry went up. This is the moment where the battle, and perhaps the war, teetered on a knife's edge. A rout on the south bank would have been catastrophic. The fleeing soldiers would have bottled up at the pontoon bridge, creating a massacre. Joan, who had been overseeing the crossing, saw her army disintegrating. She was being swept backward by the tide of her own running men. But she did not run. In a move that feels scripted by a screenwriter but is attested to by the chronicles, she wheeled her horse around. She found herself alongside the fierce Gascon captain, La Hire. They were an odd couple, the Holy Virgin and the cursing soldier. But in that moment, they shared a single, reckless thought. They grabbed their lances and charged, not away from the enemy, but straight into the teeth of the English pursuit. It was a bluff of suicidal bravery. 2 riders against an army. But the sight of the white banner moving forward while everyone else moved backward caused a psychological glitch in the English advance. They hesitated. Were these 2 leading a trap? That second of hesitation was all the French needed. Seeing the maid and the captain alone in the field, shame overcame fear. The retreating French soldiers stopped. Then they turned. The momentum snapped back like a rubber band. The French roared and surged behind Joan, crashing into the English line with the weight of thousands. The English, suddenly outnumbered and overextended, were pushed back, step by bloody step, until they were forced to retreat inside the walls of the Augustins. The gates slammed shut. The field belonged to France, but the fortress remained. Now began the grueling work of the assault. The Augustins was a hard nut to crack. The fighting dissolved into a brutal, close-quarters brawl around the perimeter. It was a hot, dusty day, and the air was thick with the sulphurous smoke of culverins and the dust of crumbling masonry. The French had to storm the palisades, dragging ladders through the ditch, hacking at the wooden stakes. Joan was everywhere, her voice cutting through the din. "Go in boldly!" she shouted. "God is with us!" She did not fight from the rear. She was in the ditch, her armour streaked with mud, a visible target for every English archer on the walls. But strangely, the arrows seemed to miss or bounce or strike the men next to her. The myth of her invulnerability grew with every hour she remained standing. By late afternoon, the pressure was too much for the English. The French militia, fueled by a mix of religious fervour and adrenaline, breached the outer defences. They poured into the courtyard of the monastery. The fighting moved inside, into the cloisters and the cells, where monks had once prayed. It was savage. The English realised the position was lost. They began to flee out the back, retreating toward their last stronghold, Les Tourelles. But the French were hot on their heels. In the chaos, the English set fire to the monastery buildings to cover their retreat. The Augustins became an inferno. The sun began to set through a curtain of black smoke and orange flame. The French had taken the monastery, but at a cost. The ground was carpeted with the dead and the dying. As night fell, the French commanders, Dunois, Gaucourt, and the others, looked at the situation with professional caution. They had won a great victory, but they were exhausted. They were on the south bank, separated from the safety of the city by the river. The men were hungry and tired. The commanders ordered a halt. "We will guard the Augustins tonight," they decided, and return to the city. "We will attack the Tourelles in a few days, perhaps after waiting for more powder." It was the sensible military decision. You do not push your luck twice in 2 days. Joan heard this decision and rejected it with absolute finality. She turned to the knights. "You have been to your council," she said, "and I have been to mine." She meant the counsel of God. "We shall not retreat. We shall not wait. Tomorrow I will leave the city only once, and I shall not return until the Tourelles is taken." She insisted that the army sleep where they stood, in the ruins of the Augustins, within shouting distance of the enemy. It was a terrifying order. The soldiers slept on the blood-soaked ground, listening to the English repairing their defences just a few hundred yards away in the dark. The air smelled of roasted meat, a grim reminder of the burning supplies, and fear. That night, the tension in the French camp was electric. Joan, despite her exhaustion, did not sleep immediately. She dictated a letter, her final one, to the English commanders in the Tourelles. She tied it to an arrow and had an archer shoot it into the fortress. "Englishmen," it read, "you have no right in this land. Go home to your own island." The English shouted back from the darkness, their voices jagged with fear and anger. "News from the Armagnac, whore," they jeered. "Wait until we catch you." The exchange was personal, hateful, and intimate. They were neighbours in death. Back in Orléans, the citizens were delirious with hope, sending boats across the river with wine and bread for the troops camping in the ruins. But inside the command tent, the mood was grim. The captains knew that the next day would be the hardest of all. Les Tourelles was not a converted monastery. It was a castle designed specifically to kill anyone who approached it. It stood on the bridge, surrounded by deep water and high stone walls. It was the keystone of the siege. If they took it, the English would break. If they failed, the army would be trapped against the river and slaughtered. Joan, finally resting on the hard ground, spoke to her chaplain, Father Pasquerel. She touched her chest just below the neck. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "blood will flow from my body above the breast." It was a prediction as precise as a weather report. She knew she would be wounded. She knew the cost. Yet she closed her eyes and slept, surrounded by the breathing of thousands of men who, for the first time in their lives, believed that a teenage girl could stop the sun from setting on their defeat. The river of fire had been crossed. Now only the stone remained. The night in the charred ruins of the Augustins was short and fitful. The dawn of Saturday, May 7th, 1429 arrived with a menacing clarity. The sky was pale and hard, promising a day of heat and dust. The French army, waking amidst the debris of the previous day's victory, looked north toward the river. Between them and the bridge stood the final obstacle, Les Tourelles. It was a formidable sight. The fortress consisted of two massive stone towers built on the final arch of the bridge, protected on the landward side by a rectangular earthwork boulevard, a fortified enclosure surrounded by a deep water-filled ditch. The walls were thick, the angles sharp, and the garrison inside was the elite of the English army, commanded by the defiant William Glasdale. They had spent the night sharpening their arrows and boiling oil. They knew this was the end game. Joan rose early. She attended a field mass, the Latin prayers murmuring through the ranks of kneeling soldiers in their dented armour. It was a moment of profound stillness before the violence. She refused to eat a heavy meal, taking only a few bites of bread. Her armour was strapped on, piece by piece, the greaves, the cuirass, the heavy pauldrons. She was not just dressing for battle. She was dressing for her own prophecy. She had told her confessor she would be wounded, yet she did not flinch as the steel enclosed her. The attack began at 7 in the morning. It was not a tactical manoeuvre. It was a bludgeoning. The French did not have heavy siege engines on the south bank to batter the walls down. They had to take the fortress by hand. They dragged scaling ladders forward under a hail of arrows and crossbow bolts that darkened the sky. The noise was deafening. The roar of culverins, the shout of Saint-Denis, the screams of men falling into the moat. The French rushed the boulevard, throwing their ladders against the high earthworks. But the English were ready. They fought with the desperate ferocity of trapped men. They used long pikes to push the ladders back, sending French soldiers tumbling into the muddy water below. They dropped heavy stones and poured burning sulphur on the attackers. The air filled with the sickening smell of scorched flesh and black powder. Joan was in the thick of it. She did not hang back. She stood at the edge of the ditch, her white banner flying, urging the men on. "Bon cœur! Bon cœur!" she shouted. "Good heart! Go in!" She was a beacon in the smoke. Around noon, seeing the attack falter, she grabbed a ladder herself. She planted it against the wall of the boulevard and began to climb. It was an act of reckless inspiration. But as she set her foot on the rung, an English crossbowman on the ramparts took aim. The bolt flew with a flat, deadly hum. It struck her between the neck and the left shoulder, punching through the gap in her armour. The force of the impact threw her backward into the ditch. A gasp went through the French ranks. "The maid is down!" The cry paralysed the attack. The English on the walls cheered wildly. They had killed the witch. They saw her being carried away by her squire and knights, limp and bleeding. The momentum of the assault evaporated instantly. The French soldiers, who had been fighting on the fuel of her invincibility, suddenly felt very mortal. They fell back, disheartened. The attack sputtered out. Joan was carried to a quiet spot in a vineyard behind the lines. The wound was deep. The bolt had penetrated 6 inches into her flesh. The pain must have been blinding. Her doctors, frantic and terrified, proposed charming the wound with incantations, a common medieval remedy. Joan, even in her agony, refused. "I would rather die than sin against the will of God," she gasped. She allowed them to pull the bolt out, a procedure of excruciating brutality, and dress the wound with lard and olive oil. She wept. It is a moment that strips away the legend and leaves the human, a 17-year-old girl, crying in the dirt, bleeding and scared. But she did not stay down. After confessing to a priest, she lay still for a while, staring at the sky. Then she stood up. The sun was beginning to dip toward the west. It was evening. The French commanders, Dunois, Gaucourt, and the others, had decided to call off the attack. They had been fighting for 10 hours. The men were exhausted. They ordered the trumpets to sound the retreat. The siege engines were being dismantled. The soldiers were turning away from the walls. The battle was effectively over. They had failed. Joan heard the trumpets. She pushed past her doctors and stumbled toward Dunois. "Do not sound the retreat," she implored. "Wait a little longer." She asked for her horse. Wincing with pain, she mounted. She rode to a quiet place in a vineyard, away from the noise, and prayed for a quarter of an hour. When she returned, her face was set. She grabbed her standard, her heavy white banner, and rode straight toward the boulevard. The sight of the dead girl returning from the vineyard, her armour stained with blood, but her banner flying high, was a hallucination to the troops. "She lives! The maid lives!" The whisper turned into a roar. The exhausted French soldiers, who had been packing up their gear, grabbed their weapons. It was a resurrection. Joan rode to the edge of the ditch and waved her banner. "Go in!" she screamed. "The place is yours." At the same moment, a strange convergence of events occurred. The French artillery in the city, firing over the river, finally found their range. A well-aimed shot struck the drawbridge connecting the boulevard to the main towers of the Tourelle, weakening the structure. Meanwhile, on the city side of the broken bridge, the citizens had floated a fireship, a barge loaded with burning pitch, under the wooden temporary span that connected the Tourelles to the north bank. The bridge began to burn. The English garrison was suddenly fighting fire on one side and a resurrected saint on the other. The French surged forward for one final, impossible push. They swarmed up the ladders with a manic energy. This time, the English faltered. Their commander, Glassdale, the man who had threatened to burn Joan, realized the boulevard was lost. He ordered a retreat into the stone towers. He ran across the wooden drawbridge, connecting the earthworks to the fortress. But the bridge, weakened by the cannon fire and the weight of armoured men, gave way. With a terrifying crack, the timber snapped. Glassdale and the elite of the English garrison fell into the river. They were weighed down by full-plate armour. They did not surface. Joan, seeing her tormentor fall, shouted to him, "Glassdale, surrender! I have great pity on your soul." But the water swallowed him. With their leaders dead and the bridge gone, the English resistance collapsed. The French poured into the Tourelles. They slaughtered the remaining defenders or took them prisoner. The sun had set, but the sky was lit by the burning bridge. By nightfall, the French flag, the golden lilies on blue, flew from the towers of the Tourelle. The key to the south was in French hands. The ring was broken. Joan, exhausted and bleeding, was ferried back across the river to Orléans. As she entered the city, the bells of every church began to ring, a cacophony of iron joy that shook the stars. The people wept as she passed. She did not stop for a banquet. She went to the house of Jacques Boucher, had her wound dressed, drank a little wine and water, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Outside, the city celebrated the end of the world they had known, and the beginning of a new one. The siege was not technically over. The English main army was still camped on the north and west, but the heart of it had been torn out. The arrow had struck, the girl had fallen, and then she had risen. And with her, France had risen too. The night of May 7th, 1429, was a strange, feverish interlude between the violence of the capture of Les Tourelles and the uncertainty of the dawn. The city of Orléans did not sleep, but neither did it truly wake. It existed in a delirium of relief. The great stone knot at the end of the bridge had been untied. The bells of the Cathedral of Sainte-Croix were ringing with such persistence that the vibrations could be felt in the cobblestones, a steady iron heartbeat that competed with the throbbing of the wounded. In the house of Jacques Boucher, the centre of this storm lay quiet. Joan, her shoulder throbbing from the crossbow bolt and her body bruised from the fall into the ditch, was finally resting. The surgeons had done their work with oil and linen, but the true healing came from the silence of the guns. For the first time in 6 months, no English artillery fired into the darkness. The monster outside the walls had been stunned into silence, but across the river and in the remaining bastilles to the west, the The mood was funereal. The English commanders, Talbot, Suffolk, and Scales, held a council of war that was more of an inquest into a disaster. They were men of hard logic, veterans who understood the bloody arithmetic of medieval warfare. But the math no longer made sense. They had superior positions, seasoned troops, and the reputation of invincibility. Yet in 3 days, they had been dismantled by a force led by a teenage girl who banned swearing. The loss of Glassdale and the elite garrison at Les Tourelles was a catastrophe. The iron necklace was shattered. The psychological impact was even worse. The English soldiers, shivering in their trenches, were now convinced that God had turned his face away from them. They whispered of sorcery, of a witch who could catch bullets and raise the dead. When an army loses its belief in its own inevitability, it is already defeated. Talbot, the English Achilles, was not a man to leave quietly. He was furious. He proposed one final, defiant gesture. They would not sneak away in the night like thieves. They would offer battle. They would draw up their lines in the open field and dare the French to come out and fight man to man, away from the walls and the magic. It was a gamble of chivalric pride. If the French accepted and lost, the siege would resume. If the French refused, the English could withdraw with their honour intact, claiming they had challenged the enemy and been ignored. And so the sun rose on Sunday, May 8th, 1429, revealing a tableau of terrifying symmetry. The citizens of Orléans, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, looked over the walls to see a sight that stopped their hearts. The English had abandoned their remaining bastilles, Saint-Laurent, Saint-Pouer, and the others. They had set fire to the wooden structures, sending plumes of black smoke into the calm Sunday air. But they had not left. The entire English army, thousands of archers and men-at-arms, was drawn up in battle formation on the plain of the Beauce, just outside the city gates. They stood in silence, standards fluttering, a wall of red and steel waiting for the harvest. Inside the city, the French captains, Dunois, Alençon, Gaucourt, saw the challenge. Their blood was up. They had the momentum. They wanted to surge out the gates and crush the English while they were vulnerable. They began to marshal their troops, forming their own battle line facing the English. The two armies stood staring at each other across a few hundred yards of open ground. The air was thick with the potential for slaughter. It was the high noon of the 100 Years' War. Joan was woken by the commotion. She was in pain, her tunic stiff with dried blood, but she sensed the danger. She knew that a battle on the open field was exactly what the English wanted. It played to their strengths, the longbow and the disciplined line. But more importantly, it was Sunday. Her voices had been clear. You do not kill on the Lord's Day unless attacked. She put on a light coat of mail. She could not bear the weight of her full-plate armour on her wounded shoulder, and rode out to the French lines. The soldiers cheered her, but she did not order a charge. She did something that baffled the military mind. She ordered a portable altar to be set up in the field, right there in the no-man's land between the two armies. She called for the priests, and then, while the English watched with perplexed fascination, the French army attended Mass. It was a surreal piece of theatre. Thousands of armed men kneeling in the dust, the Latin chants drifting across the gap to the English lines. Joan knelt with them, her head bowed. When the Mass was finished, the French commanders looked to her, expecting the order to attack. "Look at the English," she said quietly. "Are their faces turned toward us, or are their backs turned toward us?" The commanders peered through the morning haze. The English had not moved. But then, slowly, a standard dipped. A rank turned. The English were not advancing. They were pivoting. They began to march, not toward the city, but away from it, toward the town of Meung-sur-Loire. They were leaving. "Let them go," Joan said. "It is not the pleasure of God that we fight them today. You will have them another time." It was a victory of restraint. To let an enemy walk away when you have a sword in your hand requires a different kind of courage. The French soldiers watched, trembling with adrenaline, as the English columns receded into the distance. The English Achilles was walking away. The spell was broken. There would be no final bloodbath, no chaotic melee in the Sunday sun. Just the rhythmic tramp of boots fading into silence. The tension on the field snapped. A cheer began, low at first, then rising until it shook the walls of the city. The gates were thrown open. The citizens poured out, not to fight, but to loot the smoking ruins of the English bastilles. They found abandoned weapons, supplies, and the remnants of a siege that had tried to strangle them for 6 months. They tore the wood from the English forts to burn in their hearths, a final, ironic warmth provided by the enemy. Joan did not join the looting. She rode back into the city, where the streets were now carpeted with flowers thrown from windows. She was pale, exhausted, and undoubtedly in pain, but she had fulfilled her promise. She had shown them the sign she had promised at Poitiers. The siege was raised, the wind had shifted, the river had been crossed, and the stone had been moved. The impossible had been rendered into history. As the sun climbed high over Orléans that Sunday afternoon, the realization settled in. The city was safe. The road to the south was open. And France, which had been holding its breath for 100 years, finally exhaled. The war was far from over. Joan's tragic path to the stake lay ahead, as did 20 more years of fighting. But the arrow of time had changed direction. The English tide had reached its high water mark at the bridge of Orléans, and now, under the gaze of a peasant girl, it had begun to recede. The departure of the English army on May 8th, 1429, was not a chaotic rout, but a piece of solemn military theatre. They marched away in good order, banners flying, drums beating a slow rhythm that sounded less like a retreat and more like a funeral procession for an ambition. The citizens of Orléans stood on the ramparts, watching the red crosses of St. George dissolve into the heat haze of the horizon. It was a sight that defied the logic of the last 6 months. The besiegers, who had seemed as permanent as the landscape, who had built stone houses, planted gardens, and acted as if they owned the very air of the Loire, were simply evaporating. The silence they left behind was louder than their cannons. It was the silence of a sudden, unexpected vacuum, the kind that rings in your ears after a thunderclap. When the last English column disappeared toward the town of Meung, the spell of the iron necklace finally broke. The gates of Orléans, which had been barred and guarded with paranoid intensity, were thrown wide. The drawbridges were lowered, not for a sortie, but for a stroll. The people of Orléans poured out into the countryside like water bursting from a dam. They walked tentatively at first, stepping over the scarred earth of the no-man's land, touching the blackened stumps of trees, marvelling at the silence. Then, the tentative exploration turned into a scavenger hunt. The English had left in a hurry, and while they had burned their fortifications, the ruins were full of debris. There is a dark comedy in the aftermath of a siege. Citizens who had been eating rats a week earlier were now looting English cheese, English wine, and abandoned English arrows. The bastilles, those terrifying wooden choke points, were dismantled by the mob. The timber dragged back to the city to fuel the victory bonfires. The symbols of their oppression became the fuel for their celebration. But amidst the looting and the laughter, there was the grim accounting of the cost. The fields around the Tourelles and the Augustins were not empty. They were littered with the debris of the violent struggle, broken ladders, shattered shields, and the bodies of the fallen. The death toll of the siege is a matter of historical debate, but in the final days alone, hundreds had died. The river washed up, the bodies of the English who had drowned in the armour, their metal shells becoming their coffins. For the families of the French militia who had fallen at Saint-Lô or the Augustins, the victory was bitter. A saved city is of little comfort to a mother who has lost a son. The joy of May 8th was laced with the heavy metallic taste of grief. The churches, already full of thanksgiving, also filled with the soft rhythmic chanting of the Requiem. Joan did not participate in the looting. She did not ride a victory lap. Her reaction to the triumph was characteristically internal. She attended another mass, her face pale, her shoulder heavily bandaged. She was not a general revelling in conquest. She was a servant who had finished a difficult chore. She had done exactly what she said she would do, within the timeline she had predicted, against the odds that every rational man had cited. It is this stark, terrifying competence that separates her from the other mystics of her age. She didn't just see angels, she understood logistics. She had unlocked the psychological paralysis of the French commanders, proving that the English were not demons, but men who could bleed, burn, and run. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw the birth of a tradition that continues to this day. On that very Sunday, the clergy and the citizens organised a procession. They walked around the boundaries of the city, carrying candles and singing the Te Deum, thanking God and Saint-Aignan and Saint-Euverte for their deliverance. It was the first Fête de Jeanne d'Arc. Even now, nearly 600 years later, if you go to Orléans in May, you will see the city walk that same path. It is a ribbon of memory that has never been broken, a testament to the depth of the trauma and the height of the relief. The news of the liberation of Orléans rippled outward across Europe with the speed of a shockwave. In Paris, the English regent, the Duke of Bedford, was reportedly stunned. The witch had undone, in 4 days, what his brother, Henry V, had spent years building. The aura of English invincibility, the myth that God was an Englishman, was shattered. In the courts of Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, diplomats scratched their heads. The King of Boers was no longer a pathetic figure hiding in a castle. He was a monarch with a miracle in his pocket. The psychological momentum of the 100 Years' War had shifted. The English would remain in France for another 20 years, fighting a slow, losing war of attrition, but they would never again be the inevitable conquerors. They had lost the narrative. For Joan, Orléans was the beginning, not the end. The road to Reims, the coronation city deep in enemy territory, was now open, though the captains still argued it was impossible. She would drag them there too, through a series of lightning victories in the Loire Valley that historians call the Week of Wonders. She would stand beside Charles VII as the crown was placed on his head, fulfilling the second half of her impossible prophecy. Her own end, the capture, the trial, the fire at Rouen, was waiting in the distance, a dark shadow that she seemed to sense but refused to acknowledge. But on this Sunday in May, the fire was not for her. It was in the hearths of a grateful city. The siege of Orléans stands as a hinge in history, a moment where the door of the Middle Ages swung shut and something new began to open. It was the victory of the modern nation-state, France, over the feudal dynastic squabbles of the past. It was the victory of artillery and gunpowder, which had proven decisive at the Tourelles. But most of all, it was the victory of the human spirit against the calculus of despair. It proved that history is not a straight line of inevitability. It can be bent, it can be turned, it can be saved by a single, impossible variable: belief. As the sun set on May 8th, 1429, the city of Orléans settled into a sleep it had not known for half a year. The guards on the walls leaned on their spears, watching the empty horizon, not out of fear, but out of habit. The river Loire, the silent witness to it all, flowed on, washing the blood from the stones of the bridge, carrying the memory of the struggle down to the sea. The cannons were cold, the banners were furled, the girl from the oak woods had come, she had shouted at the storm, and the storm had answered. France was alive, and so we let the heavy curtain of history fall gently back into place. The shouts of the captains, the roar of the cannons, and the ringing of the victory bells fade into the soft rhythmic silence of the centuries. The smoke clears from the river, leaving only the cool mist of the Loire, drifting as it has for 1,000 years, indifferent to the wars of men. You can let go of the tension now. The city is safe. The gates are open. The winter is over. Imagine yourself standing on those ancient walls, not as a sentry, but as a dreamer. The air is cool and smells of rain and wet stone. The only sound is the water lapping against the bridge and the wind rustling through the poplars. The struggle is finished. The heroes are resting. You can rest too. Let the story dissolve into the darkness behind your eyelids, turning from history into a quiet, formless comfort. The past is a river that flows into the ocean of sleep, carrying you with it, slow and steady. There is nothing left to fight. There is only the night, deep and soft and endless, sweet dreams,